Thank you so much for visiting us here across the pond today. I understand you have a few comments you'd like to make as open remarks.
Yeah, so great to be here, first of all. It's not the first time I've been in Oxford. I've actually been in this room before, but the room was almost totally empty when I came to speak like four years ago because there wasn't that much interest in Putin in Russia, but now there seems to be a little bit more interest, and so it's great to meet you. In the summer of 2018, I was just about to start writing my book. I've written a book which I'm going to be signing for people afterwards called Freezing Order. And I just started writing this book, and I'd accumulated all sorts of experiences and traumas and unbelievable discoveries about corruption in Russia. And I knew I had to get these words on paper. And so I was really determined not to be distracted. So I put my phone face down and got on my computer and started to write, and it wasn't going very well, and I couldn't get any ideas out of my head, and after about an hour I had less than a page to show for it. And I finally, I had to turn over my phone and look at Twitter or something because I just couldn't concentrate anymore. So I turned over my phone, and there must have been 150 messages. And they were all messages because this was the moment that Trump was meeting with Putin in Helsinki. And during this summit that they were having, it was happening on a Monday, and on the previous Friday, Robert Mueller, who was the special prosecutor looking into Russian interference in the US election, had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers. And so the obvious question that was on the Friday, on the Monday at the press conference after Trump had met with Putin, was whether Putin was going to hand over these 12 GRU officers. And so some Reuters journalist asked the question, and Putin had obviously prepared for this moment, and he said, yes, it's possible that we would, but if we do so, it has to be reciprocal, and I would want Trump to hand over Bill Browder, me. So then the obvious question was, what did Trump think about this? And so the next question was to Trump, and he said, I think it's an incredible offer. And so for the next 4 days, and I was in America at the time, and so for the next 4 days, I sat on the edge of my seat thinking that 4 heavily darkened out black SUVs were going to arrive on my doorstep with a bunch of marshals to cart me off on a rendition flight back to Moscow. And it was only after the Senate, US Senate, had a vote in which they voted 98-0 not to hand me over that Trump relented. And so when I say I'm happy to be here, I really am happy to be here tonight. So I've got a lot to say about Ukraine, about Putin, about Trump, about anything you want to talk about. So floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. Why don't we start at the beginning a little bit? Your relationship with Putin in the beginning wasn't as, I guess, frosty as it is now. Could you tell us over how your relationship with your perception of him changed and why?
So I should point out to everyone here tonight that I've never met Vladimir Putin. I've never had a conversation with him. But I may be one of the most important people in the world in his head, at least from the Westerns, outside of Russia and that part of the world. Why does Putin hate me so much? He hates me because I got a piece of legislation passed called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act was named after my lawyer, my Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky worked for me in Russia when I was running this large investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. And Sergei Magnitsky discovered a massive $230 million government corruption scheme And he discovered it, he exposed it, he testified against the corrupt officials involved, and those same officials who he testified against arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, tortured him for 358 days, and killed him on November 16th, 2009. He was 37 years old. And I got the news of his murder the next morning, and I made it my life's mission after he was killed to go after his killers to make sure they face justice. And at first I thought it was possible to get justice inside of Russia. Sergei had written everything down about how they had tortured him up to the night of his death. And it was probably the most well-documented case of human rights abuse that's ever come out of Russia. But the Russian authorities circled the wagons. They covered up his murder. Vladimir Putin personally got involved in the cover-up and promoted and gave state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And so I came up with this idea, which is that if we can't get justice inside of Russia, we should get justice outside of Russia. And how do we get justice outside of Russia? Well, in this case, the people who killed him did it for money. They did it for $230 million. And they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in London, in Switzerland, in New York, in banks, and they buy houses, and they send their girlfriends to Milan on shopping trips, and their children to Swiss and British boarding schools. And so I came up with this idea, which is that if we could freeze their assets and ban their visas in the West, it's not perfect justice, but it's a lot better than total impunity. And I was able to convince a Republican senator from Arizona, John McCain, and a Democrat senator from Maryland, Benjamin Cardin, to put together a law called the Magnitsky Act, named after Sergei Magnitsky. And it was incredibly well received by the Senate. It passed the Senate 92-4, passed the House of Representatives with 89%, and became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. And Vladimir Putin went out of his mind with this Magnitsky Act. And the reason he went out of his mind was that he's a human rights violator, he's a kleptocrat, and he's stolen an enormous amount of money. I think he's worth well north of $200 billion. And he doesn't keep that money in Russia, he keeps that money in the West, and that money is now at risk. And so he, in retaliation for the Magnitsky Act, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And he went so far as to send a female lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016. Remember that famous Trump Tower meeting? And she was there with one specific mission, that if Donald Trump gets elected, she was there meeting with his son, if Donald Trump gets elected, would he repeal the Magnitsky Act? And so Vladimir Putin, he probably knew back in 2012 that he was going to do a war in 2022 and that his money would be at risk, and he hated the idea that we had any leverage over him, and this was the leverage that I created.
Wow. Sanctions against Putin on, more specifically Russia, has existed for quite a while, the implementation perhaps lacking. Why do you think, in your opinion, it took actions from you and for there to be some response and effects on Putin? What took so long, and also, do you think this is effective?
I'm having a hard time hearing you for some reason. So why? It's not coming out. It's like the
Yes. So I was saying that sanctions against the actions of Russian leaders and the state itself has existed for quite a while. Implementation perhaps lacking. Why did it take you and your allies to get attention from Putin, and more importantly, why is it so effective?
Well, so the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, and they sanctioned the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, who were the low-level people, but they didn't go after the oligarchs. And which is what they really care about. They care about the oligarchs. And I should point out that Vladimir Putin is a very rich man, but doesn't keep any money in his own name. The money is all held in the name of oligarchs. So when you see an oligarch worth 20 billion, 10 billion of that is Putin's. And that's kind of obvious. I mean, this is not some big discovery. I mean, people knew that, or the right people knew that. But nobody really wanted to touch Vladimir Putin. Everyone was sort of scared of Vladimir Putin. They didn't want to provoke him. They wanted to tiptoe around him. They wanted to appease him. Some of them were scared, I should say. And some of them, I mean, here in the UK, there were so many people that were feeding at the Russian trough. There was so much dirty money sloshing around this country, and particularly in London, that nobody wanted to do anything. And so, you know, Putin, this war that he started is not his first war. His first war was actually the moment he got started as president. He started a war in Chechnya to gain power. He killed like 50,000 Chechens. Then there was Georgia. In 2008, Putin invaded Georgia, and nobody wanted to do anything about it. President Obama said, I urge all sides to restrain themselves. He then went into Crimea, no serious sanctions. He shot down MH17, no serious sanctions. Carpet bombed civilians in Syria, nothing. Poisoned people in Salisbury with banned chemical nerve agents. We kicked a few diplomats out, and then everybody went to the World Cup in Russia. And I would argue that the reason we're having this crisis, this war right now, is because Putin thought that there would be more of the same, which is nothing. Because we gave him such a strong hint that we had no capacity to do this. And I think that Putin is 95% to blame for the murder and mayhem that's going on in Ukraine, and we're 5% to blame, we being the Western world, our governments, because we didn't do anything every other time he did something terrible.
Have you been surprised by the responses to the war at current, with the crisis?
Yeah, I'm actually amazed. I mean, normally I'm very, very critical of all governments. Most government policy is always unsatisfactory to me. But this time around, I'm actually pretty positively surprised at how the US, the UK, the EU does almost nothing ever when it comes to good policy. But this time around, it took a little longer than it should have, probably a bit too little, too late, but the fact is that we're supplying massive amounts of armaments to the Ukrainians. We have done a sanctions program which has exceeded all sanctions programs that have ever been imposed anywhere against anybody in the history of sanctions. And we seem to be kind of, unified. And so I would say I'm positively surprised, and I think Putin has backed himself into a terrible corner. He never expected this. He never expected the Ukrainians would fight back the way they have in such an incredibly brave and effective way. And he never expected that there would be any serious economic consequences. And Russia is going to go into a Great Depression because of this, because of the sanctions. And we haven't even fully done the sanctions. Every time there's another 100 or 200 innocent people bombed and destroyed, there's going to be another set of sanctions. And Putin can't help himself. He just keeps on escalating and escalating. And so I think that he's going to be really in very bad shape. And by the way, he doesn't have an unlimited amount of arms to fight this war. Like the tank manufacturers, they can't make more tanks because they need parts that they can't get anymore because of the sanctions. Same thing with airplanes. Most of the planes can't even fly. The Aeroflot planes can't even fly because they don't have, they require American parts. And so it's really pretty impressive, I would say, what the West is doing.
That is definitely very positive. I think one of the things that what's happened with surrounding Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine is that people recognizing the role that Britain's had to play in the past few decades, especially London, with Russians using it as a hub for laundering their money the past few decades. Now, I wonder what your view is on this, or more specifically, whether you think the UK is in any way complicit in the corruption endemic in Russia and how that's led to Putin's sort of like defiance to this point.
I would characterize London as the dirty Russian money capital of the world. So London is to Russia as Hong Kong is to China. Why do the Russian gangsters, oligarchs, kleptocrats, why do they love London so much? They love London because it's like the exact opposite of Russia. You know, they can steal money in Russia, they can commit terrible crimes in Russia, and then they can come to London and it's relatively safe, and we have property rights and rule of law, with a huge bonus, which is that nobody is ever going to ask from any law enforcement agency any uncomfortable questions, ever. And I say that very emphatically. There has not been a single economic crime case against Russian in the last 22 years. And that's why they love it. And you know what happened? As a result of them loving it, a whole industry of enablers spawned. The Russians have bought up most of the nice houses in the good neighborhoods, but the other nice houses have been bought up by the lawyers and PR agents and private bankers who cater to these Russians. And all of these lawyers and PR people and private bankers and lobbyists and private investigators and divorce lawyers and all these different types of people all are well connected. And so whenever anybody wanted to get tough on Russia, and I've been to Parliament probably 50 times in the last 10 years trying to urge the British government to get tough on Russia, there was always this undercurrent of quiet influence being exerted by all these people who were making so much money. And it's really, and of course we've now done the right thing. You know, Boris Johnson is doing the right thing, there's no question. But the system is still there. This system of enablers is still there. And I can imagine that given the opportunity, they would switch their enabling machine back on in a heartbeat if they were given the chance.
Just to push on the enablers, of course, British lawyers and other professionals continue to represent Russia and other oligarchs with questionable provenance and actions. Do you think there's some form of scope that perhaps we could widen some form of sanction to either ban that and prevent that in some way?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, in the meantime, it's really interesting. So I've been sued. So there was a police officer, one of the people involved in Sergei Magnitsky's arrest, and who was complicit in all sorts of the financial fraud that Sergei discovered. His name is Major Pavel Karpov, and I made a YouTube movie about him. It was very hard to get the media to write about him because everyone was afraid of libel. So I made a YouTube movie about him, and he's on an official salary of $15,000 a year, and he came to London and hired Olswangs, which is like one of the top law firms, and the head of their reputation management department, Geraldine Proudler, and paid her £600 an hour, and then had Andrew Caldecott QC, the best libel QC in the country, represent him for £1,000 an hour, and sued me for libel. And he lost. He ended up running away when he had to pay my legal bill. And and these lawyers, Geraldine Proudler, and I've got a friend named Catherine Belton. Some of you may be familiar with her book, it's Putin's People. She wrote the most definitive book, and if you want to read two great books about Russia, read my book and read her book. And I mean, it's all about how Putin is a crook. And she was sued simultaneously by 4 oligarchs: Roman Abramovich, Michael Friedman, Peter Aven, Rosneft, and then one other. And the lawyers are all, the lawyers have all gotten rich out of this type of stuff, and nobody wants to do anything here. And so what did I do? There were hearings in Congress about this whole problem about a month ago, and I came up with this idea, which is, maybe we can't sanction them. They're British citizens, they live here, but they don't have to be able to travel to America. Travel is a privilege, it's not a right. And I presented this to the congressional committee, and the chairman or the co-chairman of the committee wrote to the Secretary of State with the names of all the lawyers involved in Catherine's case and my case and various other cases, and said we should ban their visas to America. Now, I don't know if their visas will actually be banned, but I can tell you that they had a bad morning the next morning waking up to read that in the newspaper.
Do you think that forcing oligarchs back perhaps changes anything? I think in a recent interview you had with Guru Murthy, you mentioned how perhaps the current status quo with Putin being the central oligarch was definitely worse than what was before. Does forcing them back move us forward in Russia's case?
Forcing them back to Russia, you mean?
Well, forcing them back to where they were before.
Well, I think that doing anything to punish so first of all, we want to punish Putin. How do you punish Putin? The first thing they did was they put Putin on the sanctions list. It was beautiful. I remember the day they did it. I was very happy. Symbolically, it's beautiful, but practically it doesn't mean anything because Putin doesn't hold anything in his own name. And so if you want to go after Putin and get his money, you have to go after the oligarchs. And not only do you have to go after the oligarchs, you've got to go after the whole constellation of people around the oligarchs, their children, their mistresses, their wives, their ex-wives, and their trustees, nominees, custodians, etc. And in my opinion, the purpose of doing all this, so there's a big question that everyone asks, are sanctions for deterrence or are they for punishment? And it all depends on when you use them. So if we had used the sanctions before Putin had invaded Ukraine, so he could have seen we were serious, on just maybe 5% of the cases, it would have been for deterrence. But once he made his decision to go into Ukraine, Putin is a guy who never backs down. He never changes his mind. He never compromises. He never shows weakness. And so there's no more deterrent effect for the sanctions. And so now they're for punishment, but more importantly than punishment, the purpose of sanctions is so that ultimately Putin won't have enough money to pay for this war to kill Ukrainians. And so the purpose of sanctions in my mind are to dry up his savings, which are the central bank reserves which have been sanctioned, and to dry up his offshore savings, which are the oligarch money. And then we have to dry up his income, and his income is the money he gets from selling oil and gas. And that's a huge amount of money. Every day, Germany, Austria, Italy, all these European countries send him $1 billion. And every day, his war costs him $1 billion. And so we've got his savings all sorted out, but the income it's a total wash. He could carry on into perpetuity killing Ukrainians, assuming that he had the technology to build the weapons and so on. But, and so that's the sanction we haven't done. And it doesn't really matter how much of his savings we've sanctioned if we've frozen if we don't deal with that. And you've probably all heard that the EU has agreed in principle, subject to Hungary's veto, to stop buying Russian oil, and that sounds really good. The problem is that of that $1 billion a day, only 200 million is oil and 800 million is natural gas. And so we still have this natural gas problem to deal with.
Well, you mentioned ways in which we can stop or at least quench Putin's intensity in this war in Ukraine. I wonder whether there were any other outs that you suggest. I think you mentioned previously that he's got both his hands in the criminal world, not caring much for trying to save face in the face of the West. I wonder what your thoughts are on giving Putin a sort of like Sun Tzu style Golden Bridge peace option. Is that possible, sensible, and what other options do you think exist, and what could it look like?
Well, in my opinion, the reason that we're having this war is not because Putin doesn't like NATO. It's not because Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. It's not because Ukraine is flirting with democracy and independence. The reason that this war is happening is because Putin has stolen, between Putin and the 1,000 people around him, he has stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state in the last 22 years, which is money that should have been spent on hospitals and roads and education and all the other things that the government is supposed to spend money on. Instead, it's gone to private jets and yachts and Swiss bank accounts. And as a result, after 22 years, all it takes is somebody, lighting some flame, and the whole thing could go up in a second, and Putin could lose his power. And this is not hypothetical or speculative. This exact same thing happened to Nazarbayev, who was the dictator of Kazakhstan in January. He had been around for longer than Putin. Per capita, he had stolen more money than Putin. And within 1 week after raising gas prices in Kazakhstan, there was violent uprisings in every city in Kazakhstan, and he's gone, and all of his family and everybody is now under arrest, and their assets are being seized, and so on and so forth. Putin saw the same thing potentially happening to him. And so why is he doing this war? He's doing this war because that's what a dictator does when they're afraid of losing power. You create a foreign enemy. And if you create a foreign enemy, then people then don't look at their anger at you, they look at the foreign enemy. And that's what they're doing in Russia right now. And so when we come to this question of, off-ramps or negotiation or what could we give him, we can't give him anything because he needs the war. He needs to be at war. And of course, it's very painful to be at war because he's lost a lot of troops, he's lost a lot of money. But this war has been a big success for him. If you look at his approval ratings, they've skyrocketed. They've gone through the roof. And people in Russia genuinely are rallying around the flag. And so there's nothing we can offer Putin that's going to make him back down. From his perspective, he's achieved his objective by being in war. And from his perspective, the only thing he needs to do is win the war. And so coming back to how does this thing end, which is really the ultimate question for you, is the way this war ends is if Ukraine defeats Russia militarily. If Ukraine can push Russian troops out, the Russian people will no longer allow Putin to be in power. And that's the end. Otherwise, if Putin is in power, there's always going to be a war.
Wow. I wonder then if we have, in a Putin sense, reached a state of no backing down and no return. The threat of nuclear action is hovering above us, and I think in recent Russian state media, they have been actively discussing nuclear attacks. In your view, do you think this is just rhetoric or something that we should seriously be concerned of?
Well, this is Putin, thumping his chest, being a threatening person. But and so there's several questions. Does he have the capacity to use nuclear weapons if it served his interests? He would do it in a heartbeat. He has no morals, he has no ethics, he has no compassion, he has no, he's effectively a psychopath. He would do anything. But you have to ask yourself another question, which is, what kind of situation could he use nuclear weapons in, and it would be helpful to him? So let's say that he wants to shoot a nuclear weapon at us. We've been preparing for this for like 80 years. If he's going to shoot a nuclear weapon at us, we're going to shoot a nuclear weapon at him. He understands that that's the whole point of mutually assured destruction. We're not going to let him shoot a nuclear weapon at us without responding. He knows that. I mean, there's no way he'd ever shoot a nuclear weapon at us without us doing it back, and therefore, how does that solve his problem? It doesn't solve his problem. It just means we all die. So what other kind of nuclear attack could he do? He could do a nuclear attack on a more contained basis in Ukraine. He could blow up a Ukrainian city, kill 1 million people or 500,000 people, which would be a dramatic thing, and he could then threaten another city and then say, I want the whole country. But how does that help him? All he does is he kills a bunch of people, the whole world, even China and India and everyone else then surrounds him. And also he's got nuclear fallout coming towards Moscow. And so I'm not saying that it's an impossibility. He absolutely would do it if he could, but it's not clear to me what it would accomplish for him.
Shifting this a little bit to you, given how dangerous Putin is been shown to be, and even with Magnitsky, we saw exactly the lengths that we go to. You've been quite vocal and brave and courageous in your polemics about him. I wonder what drives you and what keeps you going in the face of the existential threat to your own life.
Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer. He worked for me. He uncovered a corruption scheme on my behalf, and he was tortured terribly and then killed at the age of 37. And he wouldn't have been killed and he would have been tortured if he hadn't worked for me. And I wear that burden on my shoulders every day, and I feel the fury of what they did to him every day, and that drives me every day, 12 years later, to go after the people and continue to go after them, because I'm not going to let them get away with it, and that's the driving force. And if there wasn't, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have a very personal and very profound reason to do it, but I am doing it, and I am ready to take risks doing it because Sergei was in a far riskier situation and did the right thing, and I owe it to him.
That's amazing. I'm very keen to open the floor to questions. If you'd like to make a question, please raise up your hand and I'll identify you. Also, there is an incredible offer at hand. The person with the most amazing question, chosen by Bill himself, will get a signed copy of his book, Freezing Order, which you can grab in the Glasgow room later. So yes, I'd like to pick the first question. I recognize the member with the green top.
First of all, thank you so much for your advocacy. The Magnitsky Act is an invaluable tool. There's been a lot of prognostication by professional prognosticators on the news over the past few weeks about whether it's the oligarchs who control Putin or Putin who controlled the oligarchs. Which way around do you think it is?
Putin totally, absolutely, completely controls the oligarchs. The oligarchs are only rich at the permission and pleasure of Vladimir Putin. At any point, and he's shown this to be true, he can take away their money, take away their freedom, or take away their lives. And it's really interesting. These oligarchs behave like the most arrogant, aggressive, alpha male on steroids people you could ever see if you encounter them one-on-one. And they're really unpleasant people. But it's really interesting. I go to the World Economic Forum in Davos every year, and one year Putin was there, and of course all the oligarchs are there, and to watch them in his presence, they shrink into like sniveling little school children in his presence, so scared. And so anybody who thinks that the oligarchs are going to get angry with their newly created impoverishment and they're going to rise up, it's just not going to happen. Putin is so alert to disloyalty and betrayal, and anyone who's disloyal and betrays him will die very quickly, and they all understand that. And so, sadly, that's not how this thing is going to end.
Okay, I recognize the member with the blue top.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for being here. I read your book, Enemy of the Russian State. It's one of my favorite books. I hope my question's not too personal for you, but I'm gonna try. It seems quite exceptional to me that you, as an American, ventured out to Russia to pursue the business activities that you did, and then at some point also decided to take on the Russian state, which is quite courageous. This made me wonder about your drivers in life. You, of course, mentioned the murder on Sergei, which I think is an important one. But I was wondering if there's also some, like, perhaps significant events or things in your upbringing that have shaped your character to make you do the things that you are doing nowadays.
Thank you. Good question. Very good question. Well, so what brought me to Russia, and I guess you probably know this because you read my book, my first book. Are you Dutch?
Yes.
Yeah. The very first foreign translation of my second book is Dutch. It just came out last week. And I'm actually going to Amsterdam to present it on Friday. So,
well, you're welcome to have a drink, yeah.
But anyway, in any case, so what drove me to Russia was that my grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s. And I was born in 1964. And when I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I thought, what's the best way of rebelling from this family of communists? And I put on my suit and tie and became a capitalist. And so that, and then I went to Stanford Business School and graduated business school in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And I had this epiphany when I was looking for my post-business school job, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what set me out to do that. But I also had this really weird feeling of sense of justice, which came from when I was 10 years old. And this is the second chapter in my new book. It's called The Flute. I played the flute when I was a kid, very badly. But I had this beautiful sterling silver flute that my uncle gave me as a gift. I was the last flute in the orchestra. And one day when I grew up in Chicago on the South Side. And one day I was walking to school, and I lived in a rough neighborhood, and I was walking to school, and three much larger, older kids came up to me, saw I was carrying something that looked like it was valuable, started grabbing at my flute and took my flute and stole it. And I was very upset, and the neighborhood I lived in, they had these little police phones. I picked up the police phone, the police came and got me, they took me home, and they asked me to give a statement. I gave a statement of what these kids looked like, and my mother then, after they left, my mother said, "You'll never hear from them again." But 3 weeks later, the police called me, said, "We think we found the culprits, can you come to the police station and identify them?" And my mother said, "You can't go, I don't want you getting involved." And I insisted, I have to go, I have to have justice. So I went to the police station, and they had one-way glass, and I could see them, they couldn't see me, and there was a bunch of other kids there, and I could pick the three out of the lineup. I picked them out. Then the police said, "We want you to testify." And my mother said, "Absolutely, under no circumstances can you testify." And I said, I absolutely, under every circumstance, I'm going to testify. I have to have justice. And so I went to court, the Cook County Juvenile Court, and I testified against these three kids, and we convicted them. And I became so obsessed with law enforcement that I joined the Chicago Junior Police Patrol. And in my book, you can even see a picture of my membership card. And that's what sort of has, I mean, I never became a police officer, but I've always had this sort of, feeling of indignation about crime and injustice, and that's kind of what's driven me all throughout my life.
Amazing. I recognize a member with the brown jacket. Could you wait for the microphone?
I read Catherine Belton's book, and one of the themes that she goes on about in the book is that a lot of this is an FSB group of people around Putin, and that their corruption has a political end Do you believe that, as opposed to just kleptocracy? And then the other question I have is whether the corruption in Russia is trickling down and creating a problem for the society.
So I believe every word of Catherine Belton. She's somebody I've known for 25 years, and the research that she did to create that book is truly unbelievable. And it was supposed to be a 2-year project. I think it took her like 8.5 years to write it, and she nearly went bankrupt because they gave her the advance had run out long before she ever finished it. And what she has written about and what she has described is that Russia is a police state. The police, or the FSB, which used to be the KGB, the Federal Security Service, and it's also a criminal organization, and that they're the ones who make the money. And by the way, if you want to make money in Russia, you don't start a hedge fund or a technology company. You go to government, and ideally you go to the branch of government that has the power to arrest people, and those people make the most money. The most popular course in Russia is the Interior Ministry Academy. So imagine that. And here we are at Oxford. You know, this is the most popular course in the UK. The most popular course in Russia is the Police Academy. I don't think anything's trickling down to anybody. I think 1,000 people in Russia control almost all the money there is. And then, of course, each of them have their own little constellations. But it's 140 million people are living very bad lives in Russia, and there's no benefit to anybody of the system.
Yes, but the reason for my question is that often, or at least what one's seen across the world, is that when you have corruption at the top, basically nobody believes in anything anymore. And then the corruption just trickles down. Everything becomes corrupt. The schools become corrupt, the hospitals become corrupt, the whole system just crumbles from the inside. I'm wondering whether this is happening in Russia.
Yeah, of course. Everybody assumes it is happening. And if you're not corrupt, they think you're a fool. I was going on and on about corporate governance and anti-corruption matters, and the Russians thought I was just a fool, like a really idiotic man. Like, what kind of stupid person would do that? They would look at me with just such disdain because, like I was some kind of hillbilly or something like that. Like, how could I be so unsophisticated? Because of course that's how it works. And even in the villages where like people are going to their outhouse because they can't afford a toilet, they still just assume that if you're the mayor, you get to steal all the money. That's just how it works. And if they ever get to become the mayor, they'll steal all the money. And that's just the system.
Thank you. I recognize the member at the front bench there with a white top.
Thank you. So the Western cultural imagination has adopted a somewhat myopic view of corruption as a Russian concept, when in fact isn't corruption manifest in many parts of the developing world? And wouldn't it be better for our politicians to create legislation that imposes penalties on anyone who has perpetrated corruption and moved their funds overseas, such as Chinese diplomats and people from all over the world?
Definitely. So the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, and it was just a piece of legislation for Russia. And Putin went out of his mind, as I mentioned. And John McCain and Senator Cardin said, well, hell, if Putin's so upset about this, I'm sure the dictator in China and Iran wouldn't be too happy about this either. Let's make a global Magnitsky Act. And in 2016, the United States passed the Global Magnitsky Act. And there are now 34 countries that have global Magnitsky Acts. And Chinese officials who are involved in the concentration camps in Xinjiang are on the list. The generals in Myanmar who are responsible for the Rohingya genocide are on the list. Nicaraguan security officials who shot down peaceful student demonstrators are on the list. The Gupta brothers who stole all sorts of money in South Africa are on the list. Dan Gertler, an Israeli diamond dealer who completely gutted out the Democratic Republic of Congo, is on the list. So yeah, it's absolutely. But having said that, just to come back to your initial point, Russia's they're better at corruption than anybody else. I had a friend who for about a year was the prime minister of Georgia. it was like a very short thing. He was a former investment banker, became prime minister of Georgia when Saakashvili first came to power, and lost his job in some power struggle. And he joined the Cato Institute in Washington, and the Cato Institute asked him to go and lecture about corruption and good governance in different African countries. And so he went on a big tour of Africa, and I met up with him at the end of his African tour, and I said, "What's it like? Those places must be really corrupt too." And he said, "I've nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the post-Soviet world. The level of stealing that they do in Africa is just minuscule compared to." And he was talking about Georgia and Russia and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. It's not just Russia, but just off the charts what happens in the former Soviet Union.
Thank you. I recognize the member just right there. The one I can't see you. Yep, him right there. Yep.
Thank you. A quick question. Do you mind Russia after Putin? What do you think that will happen after Putin in Russia? Because so far my impression is that corruption is so pervasive that even with a different leader, or not talk about the leadership, but with a different government, you will have probably the same outcome. At least for Russians, probably not a war, but you will have this kind of conflicts and friction with the West. Thank you.
Well, it's kind of an optimistic question, life after Putin. I think the most likely scenario is that Putin stays in power for his entire natural life, which probably is a long time. Some people say he's sick. I don't believe that, but maybe he is. But more likely than not, he's going to live for 10 or 15 years more. He's 69 years old. He could be a dictator until his mid-80s, and so you'll all be middle-aged people by the time Putin is gone. What is life like after Putin? It all depends on how Putin ends up not being there. If he dies a natural death in his sleep, then it'll be some other KGB crook who takes over. That's what they did in Uzbekistan. It was really interesting. In Uzbekistan, which is another country even more oppressive than Russia, there was a guy named Karimov who was their dictator. And one day he died in his sleep at the age of 87 or something like that. And then it was like in the Vatican, they went into some building, all the powerful people, and the white smoke came out of the chimney, and they emerged, and the head of the KGB was then the new dictator of Uzbekistan. And everyone was all very excited because he was a reformer, because he wasn't boiling his political opponents in vats of acid. That made him a reformer. If for some reason Putin loses this war, and the Ukrainians drive his troops out of Crimea and places like that, he could be replaced in a popular uprising. And if there's a popular uprising, Alexei Navalny is the obvious next leader of Russia. He has put himself perfectly in position to do that. And it's possible that Alexei Navalny could run a country that's democratic and honest and successful. Russia doesn't have to be a dirty, corrupt country. There are plenty of Russians, in spite of whatever the previous culture is, that would be glad to have an honest country. And there's a famous Russian expression that the fish rots from the head. And if the person who's running the country is a good leader, look at Zelensky. Ukraine never had this sense of patriotism like it does now. A good leader can do amazing things, and I don't think we should write Russia off. It all depends on who that leader is.
Thank you. I recognize the member with the grey and purple top.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering what you think of the danger of post-Putin, whenever that is, of a leader who is not only just as corrupt, but possibly even just as militaristic, which maybe not many people are thinking about. And I wondered what your thoughts on that are.
Well, this is one of the things that Putin likes to point out. He says, if it wasn't me, it would be somebody even worse than me. How can you get any worse than Putin? I mean, I just don't see it. I mean, Putin is truly he's in the same league as Adolf Hitler, Stalin. He's truly the most horrific, evil, violent, malign influence on the world. And so I would say very clearly that I don't think you can get worse than Putin. I think that whoever replaces him, even if they're not Alexei Navalny, they're not going to be the kind of monster that he is. He's a special kind of monster.
Thank you. The member with the blue top at the front row.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask you, if this war drags on and the Ukrainians keep fighting as fiercely as they are, but also Putin, because of his oil and gas sales and because of the might of his army, is able to sort of keep fighting them, do you think there's a risk that the Russian people, you mentioned that his approval ratings have skyrocketed, but I think I'm right in saying that the number of casualties that Russia has suffered in Ukraine exceed 10 years in Afghanistan up to now. And Afghanistan, was one of the reasons why Russians became so upset with the Soviet Union. Do you think there's a scenario in which Russian mothers seeing the body bags that are coming back and the never-ending war could turn against Putin within the war context?
Well, I think part of the reason that all the bodies from Afghanistan caused so much trouble was they came back in dribs and drabs over a long period of time, and people really had opportunity to get upset about them. I mean, as you say, and you're right, I think 20,000 people have died, 20,000 troops have died from Russian troops have died in Ukraine versus 10,000 over 10 years in Afghanistan. But I mean, they're dead, and do we see an uprising right now? No, that we don't. And I do think that it creates a very brittle situation, having all these sanctions, having all this trouble, and it's highly combustible. But he's also running a total police state. Nobody has any alternative information. He shut down all social media. He shut down all independent media. He shut down the internet effectively. He puts people in jail who call the war a war. It's got to be called a special operation, otherwise you go to jail for 15 years. It's a very scary place. I mean, and look, North Korea is still functioning, the way that Kim Jong-un wants it to function. There's no reason why Putin can't run a very tight dictatorship and carry on doing all sorts of terrible things with all sorts of people dying and not having any, not feeling any pressure from the people. I mean, I think that's the more likely scenario.
The member with the red top.
Thanks very much for being here. I had a question about the sort of army of consultants and PR folks and bankers and you name it that sort of service Russian oligarchs, but also folks from the Gulf, authoritarian leaders there. How can we kind of roll back that army of people that are doing that work closer to home?
It's something that's very near and dear to my heart. Well, we have, interestingly, the UK, the US, and the EU have now banned those people, banned consultants, PR firms, and other people like that from doing business with Russia. But they have not done it with Saudi Arabia or Azerbaijan or lots of other terrible places. After I wrote my book, my book is really all about these enablers, and I was contacted by somebody at Harvard Law School who wants to start a campaign on campus, which is for people to not allow firms that do business with dictatorships to recruit on campus, and I think that's just great. And these people. What's interesting about these people that you're talking about is like they go to the same, their kids go to the same school that my kids go to. We're all standing at the school gate. Their wives or husbands, if they're women, go to the Human Rights Watch dinner gala and donate $5,000, and they're busy advising the government of Saudi Arabia. It's remarkable how accepted this whole thing is. And so part of the way you stop it is just by making it so that anyone who does that kind of work is like being a mafia lawyer. And if you're a mafia lawyer, you shouldn't be accepted in polite society. People should shun you. Law school graduates shouldn't want to go to work for you, and so on and so forth. We don't need government policy for that. We can create our own sort of social mores where where it's just someone who does that, they walk into a party and everyone just sort of turns the other way.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question. I recognize the member with, I think, an orange strap around their neck.
Thank you. So Putin and Russian government, they use the narrative to counter the Western narrative. And they say when US and NATO allies, they bomb countries like Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia, and the list goes on. So that is not considered as such an evil thing, but when Russia does it in Ukraine, that becomes an evil. What would you say, and what is this something that is discussed in US, especially in the political circles?
Well, there's a word for what you've just described. It's called whataboutism. Whenever whenever we start talking about Russian corruption, they say, "What about slavery in the U.S.? And what about Nicaragua? What about this?" You know what? I mean, yeah, it's a terrible thing. What's going? What the Saudis are doing in Yemen. It's a terrible thing what the U.S. did in Afghanistan. Mostly terrible about leaving the country to the Taliban. But that doesn't justify a naked invasion of a country, redrawing the borders, killing innocent civilians. You want to talk about that? We can talk about that. But what's going on? I mean, and there's been many wars over history, but there's not that many wars that are taking place live on our television screens with social media. This is the most social media covered war there ever has been, where we can see it all, and it's horrifying. And when you can see what's going on, that creates a whole other set of reactions. And I'd be very glad to criticize bad policy wherever bad policy is executed, but this is a very bad thing going on right now, and needs the full criticism of everybody out there. And it's very upsetting to me that the South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, India, China, Indonesia, all these countries are sitting on their hands saying, it's okay. That really upsets me. Particularly South Africa. In South Africa, we all stopped doing business with companies that were supporting apartheid. And, the pressure from the West got South Africa to abandon apartheid, and then the South African government is siding with Putin. That just infuriates me. But anyways, that's a lot longer conversation.
Yeah, that concludes the question element of today from the audience. Just one last one, as a question we're asking all our esteemed guests and speakers, is that in 2 sentences, what advice would you give to our members of our society and the wider university in terms of going about life and what next steps they want to take?
Don't do business with crooks. You'll get crooked.
All right. Thank you. It's been a true pleasure, Bill. Thank you for visiting us today. Hope you can all join me in thanking Bill for coming today.